11의 사회를 맡은 신대윤입니다. 저는 KSCF 이사장이기도 하고 또 한국IMC 전국연맹의 이사이기도 합니다. 시민운동위원장을 맡고 있습니다. 오늘 이 주제는 동아시아와 한반도 평화정착을 위한 국제적 지지운동이라는 제목의 세션입니다. 저는 굉장히 이 제목 자체에 대해서 굉장히 흥미로운 관심을 가지고 이런 흥미로운 주제의 세션에 참석하게 돼서 생각합니다. 오늘 이 세션에 참석해 주신 여러 분들께 감사 말씀드리고 강사님을 소개하겠습니다. 이 강사님 존 펜퍼 선생님은 어제도 전체 토론에 스카스를 하셨기 때문에 뭐 다 특별한 소개가 필요 없을 것 같은데 간단하게 소개를 드리겠습니다. 미국 분이시고 현재는 미국 정책연구원의 소장을 맡고 계십니다. 그리고 이전에는 미국 정책연구원의 외교정책 포커스 소장이었고 또 미국의 국제관계센터 국제문제 담당 국장으로 지나셨습니다. 어제도 말씀하신 거 들었겠지만은 옆에서 들으면 한국 사람이 말하는 줄 알겠습니다. 제가 아까 5분 후에 시작하겠습니다. 그리고 I announced 이렇게 말씀드렸더니 5분 후에 시작하지 마 그러시더라고요. 5분 후에 이렇게 말씀하셔서 다 알아들으시니까 제가 한국말을 이렇게 잘하시는 분이 참 뵙기 어려운데 발음도 아주 정확하셔가지고 진짜 안 보고 들어보는 부분이 하시고 또 재밌게 말씀하시는 것도 참 좋고 여러 가지 기대가 많이 됩니다. 우리 강사님께 큰 박수로 보내주시면 감사합니다. 그러면은 1차로 강사님의 그 스피치를 한 50분 정도 듣고 한 40분 정도를 가지고 토론하도록 하겠습니다.
제가 한국말로 공부했지만 지금 조금밖에 못해요. 하기로는. But I will speak in English. So don't worry.
됐어요? 안 돼요?
들려요.
됩니까?
Better. Okay, so the title is, I actually forget the title, but it's about transnational cooperation and how it can help here in Korea. But first, before I start talking about that topic, I want to ask you what year you think it is right now. What year? 2010? 2012? 2018? No, it's 1988. Why do I say it's 1988? Because the situation here in Korea right now is comparable to what it was in 1988 in Europe, 1 year before the end of the Cold War. Korean Peninsula faces a choice right now that Europe faced in 1988. Will it move toward greater integration, or will it move in the opposite direction? Because reunification is not inevitable, it is a choice. It is something we struggle for. It is something we hope for. We cannot take it for granted. I'll give you the two paths that took place on June 4th, 1989. This was before the fall of the Berlin Wall, which took place in November. On June 4th, 1989, what happened? in the world on June 4th, 1989. Tiananmen Square. That was one path. People struggled, they protested, and the government cracked down. It was not inevitable that there would be change in China. The Chinese government stepped in and suppressed the people in Tiananmen Square. But what else happened on June 4th, 1989? On June 4th, 1989, I was in Warsaw because that was where the first free or semi-free Polish elections took place. That was the other path. And the same day, in China, the government cracked down. In Poland, the government did not. And Solidarity Trade Union was successful in changing Poland. These are the two paths that are available to the Korean Peninsula. Transformation or a step backward. And that's why transnational efforts, transnational movements are so important. Because we play a role in change. We can't take things for granted. We can't assume that reunification will just happen. It will only happen if we, all of us, work toward it. I want to give you an example of a transnational movement in Europe in 1988. And whether it provides, this is a question, does it provide an example for Korea looking forward? The name of the movement was the Helsinki Citizens Assembly. And the Helsinki Citizens Assembly was an attempt by peace activists and human rights activists in East and West Europe to work together to change Europe. Not just Eastern Europe, not just to democratize Eastern Europe, but to transform Western Europe as well, to transform the security system in Western Europe, the reliance on nuclear weapons, the reliance on war. This was an effort by people like us in both Eastern and Western Europe. In 1988, they got together secretly in Eastern Europe, and they made a plan that they would have their first gathering in November 1989 in Prague, and they expected that they would be arrested. They thought, we will come together from Eastern Europe and Western Europe to Prague, and the Czech government will arrest us all. But what actually happened was the Velvet Revolution took place in the Czech Republic in November, shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the Helsinki Citizens Assembly decided to postpone for a year. All of their efforts, in other words, had been successful even before they met for the first gathering in 1989. And when they did meet in 1990, Václav Havel, who was one of the leaders of the Helsinki Citizens Assembly, was no longer in jail. He was president of the country, and he welcomed all of us to Prague. What relevance does this have for Korea? Well, this was obviously from two parts of a divided Europe, Eastern Europe and Western Europe, very different experiences, working together. That's very similar to the situation here on the Korean Peninsula. What was interesting about it was that it was human rights activists and peace activists who had different agendas, but decided to work together toward a common agenda. And that common agenda was the transformation of Europe. Now I want to ask, does this have relevance for us here? First point I would make is that the Helsinki Citizens Assembly imagined that it could be a transformation from below to create a new security system. A popular security system, people-centered security. Not nuclear weapons, not government-to-government negotiations, but actually people talking to people. One of the structures that they imagined was a kind of shadow structure to what existed at the time, which was called the CSCE, Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. The Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, CSCE, was created in 1975, also known as the Helsinki Process. And it included all the countries of Europe, plus the Soviet Union, plus the United States. And it was a government-to-government arrangement, and it was designed to address questions of peace, questions of human rights, and the possibility of exchanges, scientific, educational. It was really the only governmental organization that addressed these issues all in one place. It was controversial, it was not always successful, but it was a vision of a new kind of Europe. The Helsinki Citizens Assembly said, that is good, we like the CSCE process, but we want to have a people's CSCE. Not just governments, but the people from all of these countries. Because there are a lot of questions that we want on the table that the governments are not putting on the table. So this was their vision of a future Europe. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall, this is what happened. The Helsinki Citizens Assembly established groups in all the countries of the CSCE, and they became a kind of shadow organization that brought people's concerns to the CSCE and also expanded the CSCE's general agenda. Now, I think this is a very important point for Korea and for East Asia in general. Number one, a lot of people have proposed having a kind of CSCE process in East Asia. East Asia does not have a regional security forum. Mostly because North Korea is not recognized diplomatically. There's a hole here in East Asia, a hole of regional security. So there have been proposals to have a kind of CSCE process. But the only way that will go forward is if Korean reunification goes forward. Because you cannot have regional security here with a divided peninsula. The second reason it's important is because here in East Asia, there are not a lot of opportunities for people to become involved in security conversations. It's mostly governments. It's the leaders of two countries sit down and have a summit. Sometimes there are trilateral discussions, Japan, South Korea, the United States. But where are the people in all of this? There are no popular opportunities for people to bring their issues to the table. So both of these, the official governmental CSCE process and the shadow Helsinki Citizens Assembly type process, I think would be very useful here in East Asia as a kind of transnational effort. But here's where there are major differences between the European experience and the Korean experience. I mean, we obviously do not have a CSCE here in East Asia. We do not have popular involvement or mobilization and security issues having that kind of impact. And here are some of the reasons I think, here are the obstacles. The first obstacle is human rights. I mentioned that in Europe you had human rights activists and peace activists working together. But here, especially in Korea, human rights is not a unifying issue. Human rights is a dividing issue. You know here in South Korea that the issue of human rights, North Korean human rights, is very controversial. Conservatives say that progressives are not focusing enough on human rights issues. The South Korean government has not raised human rights issues during the summits. The North Korean government is sensitive to questions of human rights. The North Korean government, of course, participates in a number of human rights discussions at the UN. However, it often sees human rights as an agenda for regime change in the country. So for instance, the North Korean government has not allowed in the UN Special Rapporteur on human rights to look at the situation in the country. So the human rights issue is a divisive issue, not just for the governments, but also for us. We have difficulties dealing with this question of human rights. Now, I think there are ways around this problem. I'll give you an example. I just told you that the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights has never visited North Korea. But there has been a Special Rapporteur on Human Rights who has visited North Korea. One was a woman and was on the issue of disability rights. North Korea signed the UN Treaty on Disability Issues, and the Special Rapporteur went there and had a dialogue with the government. So I want to emphasize that North Korea does not refuse all discussions of human rights. There are opportunities for engagement, but it has to be a certain way. Okay, so in general, I said human rights issue is a divisive issue for us working on inter-Korean relations. The peace issue. Unfortunately, the peace issue, as it was in Europe in the 1980s, can be divisive here too. Because the peace issue in Europe was an anti-nuclear issue, focusing on nuclear weapons. But as you know, focus on nuclear weapons here on the Korean Peninsula, that can be divisive too. So for instance, should we be insisting that North Korea give up all of its nuclear weapons unilaterally? Well, you heard in earlier sessions that there is some skepticism about that particular position. Why should North Korea give up its nuclear weapons and other countries like the United States don't have to give up their nuclear weapons? A focus on nuclear weapons, in other words, is not a unifying issue for us either. Peace might be, if we express it rather abstractly, but not nuclear weapons. So the two key issues that unified activists in Europe in the 1980s are divisive here in Korea. Let me talk about one other issue that was present in the 1980s and that was important in terms of the transformations, and that is nationalism. Nationalism played an extremely important role in the transformations in Eastern Europe. They were inspired often by both national unity, but also a common enemy, namely the Soviet Union and the Soviet control of Eastern Europe. So nationalism played a unifying force in the transformations in the 1980s. Okay, ultimately, it played a divisive force as well, but at least up until 1988, 1989, it was a unifying force. Here, obviously, in Korea, Tanil Minjok, unifying force. Nationalism plays a unifying force. It's one people, one blood. North and South Koreans can relate to one another based on national unity. However, nationalism also is problematic here on the Korean Peninsula. Why? Well, I would say for 3 reasons. Number 1, North Korea has its own national identity that is separate from South Korea. North Koreans define themselves not just as Koreans, but as North Koreans, or as citizens of the DPRK. That is a specific identity that has been developed over decades. And they're not going to just give it up. South Koreans too have a specific national identity that is different from just Korean identity. An identity that has been connected to globalization, has been connected to the specific democratization experience of South Korea. So you have 2 very different identities that coexist with a one blood, one people notion. But the other reason that nationalism can be divisive is because in East Asia in general, other countries perceive Korean nationalism as a problem. I mean, we'd like maybe, while we're here, to pretend otherwise, but the Japanese are not enthusiastic necessarily about Korean nationalism. Chinese are not enthusiastic. There are territorial disputes, there are history disputes, there are economic disputes, there are political disputes. In other words, Korean nationalism, even if it is successful in uniting the 2 Koreas, is not necessarily the best vehicle for East Asian reconciliation and integration. Okay, so where have I brought you all so far? I've looked at 3 issues: human rights, anti-nuclear, and nationalism. These are transnational issues. These are issues with which people outside the Korean Peninsula can partner with people inside the Korean Peninsula to bring about change. But all 3 of these issues, all 3 of these topics are problematic because they can be divisive both within the peninsula and within East Asia more generally. I'm not saying they won't be part of all these discussions. Of course, human rights, anti-nuclear sentiment, and nationalism are part of all of these processes. But I want to bring up a 4th possibility. I want to bring up a 4th possibility that really wasn't present in Europe strongly in the 1980s, with the exception maybe of Germany, and that is environmentalism. In the 1980s, environmentalism had produced a Green Party in Germany. It produced a strong environmental movement in Hungary that was part of the transformations. But generally speaking, it was not a major aspect of the changes in the 1980s. After the Berlin Wall fell, in the 1990s, people discovered what a terrible environmental situation there was in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And of course, even in Western Europe, people were discovering that the capitalist developments had produced a lot of pollution, a lot of environmental problems. But this is still different from the situation we're in today. The situation we're in today is one in which we all recognize a common threat. Not just it's ominous. Are we okay outside? As I was saying, a common threat that involves all of us. Okay, so we know that environmental pollution is a problem here in Korea, a problem in Japan. We know that there's a yellow dust problem coming from China. We know that there's water pollution. Okay, so those are specific environmental threats. But I'm talking about the threat of climate change. The threat of climate change is one that affects all countries in this region in a way that can be unifying. Unifying in a way that human rights, anti-nuclear peace issues, and nationalism are not unifying. So what do I mean by climate change as unifying? And I'm going to talk about it in two ways. One in terms of the Korean Peninsula, and the other in terms of East Asia more generally. In terms of the Korean Peninsula, we have an unusual situation, and I was very struck by your comments about Germany and the importance of West Germans to recognize that they are not better than East Germans. Okay? There can be an unconscious feeling here in South Korea, even among us who are progressive, I'm assuming you're progressive, but among us progressives, that the South is, well, better than the North, okay? I mean, we have here in the South better, economy, there's democracy, the K-pop is more interesting. There's just a kind of unconscious, almost, feeling that South Korea is better on many indicators. Okay, we can argue about that, obviously. But on one issue, in particular, North Korea is actually better than South Korea at this moment in time, and that's environmental issues. Now, it may not be because it intentionally wanted to be better, but because of the collapse of manufacturing in the 1980s and 1990s, North Korea has a much, much smaller carbon footprint than South Korea. Moreover, North Korea prides itself on its natural beauties, on the mountains, on the wonderful places you can go to on the seaside, all the way up north to the glacial lake. North Korea has beautiful, beautiful places. It, in other words, is better than South Korea. And it's important when you come together at the same table for both sides to be able to say, well, we're good at this, but you're good at that. But it goes beyond just being good. It goes beyond that because North Korea can do two things on environmental issues. It can be a model for South Korea, and it can also, together with South Korea, leapfrog, jump over existing dirty technologies. This is something South Korea has to do. South Korea talks very good about carbon footprint, talks very good about climate change. You have several UN organizations based in Korea focusing on green development. But actually, when you look at South Korea's energy profile, it's not good. And if you look at South Korea's carbon footprint, it is not good. So there is a gap between the rhetoric of South Korean government and the reality of South Korea's carbon output. So in other words, South Korea and North Korea both have to work together to jump over existing dirty technologies. this, focusing on something new, is absolutely critical in reunification. Because if you're just looking at the past, or you're just looking at the present, then you don't have vision. You'll be stuck saying, I'm better on this issue, you're better on that issue. No, you want to work together to create something fundamentally new. And on environmental issues, this is the opportunity. That's on the Korean Peninsula. But it's also an opportunity for the region as a whole. Because honestly, Korea is not alone in being bad on energy issues. Japan too talks very good about green energy, sustainable energy. But in practice, Japan is not very good either. China, of course, is wonderful in terms of its export of wind turbines, its creation of solar panels. It has poured money into new energy technologies. But China, too, is still very much in the old style of dirty coal producing energy. So the region as a whole has to come together around a new vision. And it is this that the Korean Peninsula can offer. Not, we are just Koreans and you're Japanese and you're Chinese, and we're going to continue to argue with you about history and about territory and about economics. No. It's an opportunity for Koreans to say, look, we together, North and South, are creating a new green future. But it can only happen if we all work together in this region. And more important than that, even more important to that, is Korea's say, this is not just for the region, but we become a model for the world. Because this is the most dynamic economy or economic space in the world, Northeast Asia. 2 Koreas, China, Japan, Taiwan. If we change the economic model in this region, then we change it for the world. So I am raising the stakes here. I'm saying that Korean reunification has to be bigger than just Korea. It has to have a vision that is for the region and for the world. And then, only then, I think, reunification can be successful. Only then can Korea avoid the 1989 scenario of Tiananmen Square. Only then can the 2 Koreas avoid the pitfalls of German reunification. Only then will the two Koreas create something fundamentally new, different, and I dare say revolutionary for the world as a whole. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다. 50분 하실 걸로 마음을 굳게 먹고 있었는데 10분이나 일찍, 10분 이상 일찍 끝나셨습니다. 어제도 그러셨는데 오늘도 이제 역동적인 역사를 해주셔서 감사합니다. 오늘 굉장히 넓은 범위의 주제들을 다루신 것 같습니다. 그래서 이 토론의 폭이 굉장히 넓을 수 있을 것 같은데 우선 그 토론이나 혹은 질문이나 이런 거를 좀 듣도록 하겠습니다. 이제 참가자 중에서 누구시든지 의견을 말씀을 해주시면 좋겠습니다. 제가 좀 잠시 좀 요약을 해보면은 우선 우리 페퍼 선생님 말씀은 이 인권 또 민족주의, 핵문제 이런 것들이 논쟁적인 논의를 하게 만드는 그런 주제들일 수가 있는 반면에 환경보호, 특별히 기후변화 관련 이 부분은 좀 더 통합적으로 이야기할 수 있는 그런 주제일 것 같다. 그렇게 말씀하시는 걸 저는 그렇게 들었습니다. 이 말씀은 지금까지 우리가 한국에서, 국내에서 토론에서 잘 하지 않았던 그런 이슈를 말씀하신 것 같습니다. 어느 분이 좀 말씀해 주시겠습니다. 간단하게 자기소개를 좀 해주시면서 말씀해 주시면 좋겠습니다.
네, 안녕하세요. 정주진이라고 합니다. 일단 맨 마지막 부분이 마지막 부분이 핵심인 것 같고 아주 인상적인데 그거와 관련해서 제 생각은 먼저 그 한국의 환경단체들은 이 남북 문제에 있어서 거리를 두고 있습니다. 그러니까 남북 문제에 적극적으로 나서지 않고 있죠. 물론 이제 남과 북이 다뤄야 될, 공동으로 다뤄야 될 환경 문제가 있다는 것은 알고 있고 인식을 하고 있지만 그거는 자기 영역이 아닌 걸로 하고 있습니다. 그래서 과연 환경 단체들이 아니면 환경에 관심 있는 사람들이 이 문제를 다룰 수 있을 것이냐, 남과 북의 환경 문제를 공동의 이슈로 메리트로 해서 다룰 수 있는 것. 두 번째는 한국 정부가 그럴 수 있느냐. 한국 정부 역시 환경 문제를 같이 주요 현안으로 남과 북이 같이 할 수 있는 현안으로 다룰 준비나 아마 상상을 안 하고 있을 것 같다. 그래서 그게 있고, 그다음에 또 하나의 의문은 북한이 과연 이런 식의 어프로치를 받아들일 수 있느냐. 그러니까 북한은 개발이 많이 필요한 나라고 불가피하게 환경이 좋은 나라가 됐지만 말씀하셨다시피 공장을 더 많이 짓고 제조업을 발전시켜야 되고 개발을 해야 돼서 불가피하게 탄소를 많이 배출해야 되는, 오히려 더 배출해야 되는 상황인데 북한이 과연 이런 식의 외부자의 접근을 받아들일 수 있겠느냐. 그래서 제가 드리고 싶은 질문은 그러면 북한이 설득할 수 있는 논점은 뭐가 있겠는가, 아이디어. 그리고 그게 어떻게 보면은 제 개인적으로는 좀 약간 윤리적 문제하고도 겹치는 문제인 것 같습니다. 왜냐하면은 우리가 당면한 이익에서 북한에게 뭔가 그들이 원하지 않는 문제를 제기한다는 것에 대해서, 그래서 이제 북한을 설득할 수 있는, 만약에 이게 필요하다면 공감대가 형성된다면 그게 있고요. 또 하나의 문제, 또 하나의 것은 이거 환경과 다른 건데 이제 인권 문제를 얘기하셨는데 북한 인권 문제에 있어서 시민사회 단체, 진보적인 시민 단체들도 이걸 언급해야 된다는 필요성을 내부적으로는 이미 얘기를 하고 있습니다. 물론 밖으로는 아직 얘기는 안 하고 있죠. 근데 이제 우리가 동시에 걱정하는 것은 미국의 인권 단체들이 트럼프나 그런 회담할 때 이제 어떤 압력, 인권 문제를 다뤄라라고 할 때, 근데 이제 우리는 그들의 순수성에 의문 제기를 좀 하고 있거든요. 한국의 북한 인권 단체들도 그렇고, 미국의 인권 단체들도 그렇고. 그래서 이 문제에 있어서 어떤 그 영역을 넘어서서, 진보 보수 이런 걸 넘어서서 진짜 순수하게 인권 문제를 다룰 수 있는 가능성이 있겠는가? 한국의 시민단체도 좀 잘 아시니까 그런 아이디어가 있으면 좀 같이 나눠주시면 좋겠습니다.
혹시 같은 주제에 대해서 질문 있으시면 제가 하도록 하겠습니다. 혹시 같은 주제에 대해서 질문 있으시면 해주시고 아니면은 답변을 좀 진행을 하고 또 하도록 했으면 좋겠습니다.
Well, those are very good questions and difficult questions. Let me start with the human rights, and then I'll go to the environmental issue. Yes, some human rights organizations, or I should say some organizations that talk about human rights, are less concerned about the issue of human rights in North Korea than they are about, say, changing the regime in North Korea, because they believe fundamentally that North Korea, as it exists now, will never improve the human rights situation for the country as a whole, and that only regime change can improve human rights. Okay, so they do have a regime change perspective. But I do think that the human rights organizations, in other words, organizations that are devoted to human rights generally around the world, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they are devoted specifically to human rights questions and are divorced from, apart from, any kind of regime change perspective. And they believe that it can be possible to have incremental change within North Korea. And that's why I brought up the disabilities issue, because that's just one issue that human rights campaigners have been successful on. But it's not the only one. There's been progress on rights of children, women's rights. There even was a dialogue on political and civil rights between the North Korean government and the European Union that took place mostly during the late 1990s, early 2000s. And that also went a certain way forward. I have what might seem to be a contradictory position. In other words, I believe for the current negotiations on nuclear questions and inter-Korean affairs to go forward, the human rights issue should not be on the governmental table. At the same time, I do believe that non-governmental organizations should both raise human rights issues in the traditional name and shame fashion, and at the same time look for engagement possibilities with DPRK on human rights issues, like we see on the disability question. And I want to emphasize that this disability question, you might think, oh, well, you know, North Korea is just rhetorically kind of dealing with this issue. It signed the UN treaty, but it doesn't fundamentally care. Actually, the North Korean government has done something quite unusual on the disabilities question. Number one, it established a GONGO, a government-organized NGO, which were very popular in the Soviet times, but are unusual in North Korea. It doesn't have that many GONGOs. So just the fact that it established this government-organized NGO is important. But more important than that is the growth of actual voluntary organizations in North Korea organized by disabled people themselves, all throughout the country. I would argue that this is the first sign of genuine civil society, at least in terms of asserting rights. And these disabled organizations are asserting their rights within the North Korean sphere. It's not perceived as dangerous by the North Korean government. It's simply seen as an assertion of a community's rights to their own livelihood, because it's mostly organizing for income generation activities. So this actually, I think, is an unbelievable transformation in the DPRK. And it has been done on behalf of or by human rights organizations, disability rights in this case. Okay, so that's human rights. On the environmental issue, let me tell you a story. On my first trip to the DPRK in 1998, I sat down with the Ministry of Architecture, and I said, you know, your buildings here are cold. There is absolutely no consideration of energy efficiency in the construction of buildings. For instance, you know, having windows that are south-facing so that you get light all the time. I mean, not even active solar, but passive solar, as it's called. And other energy-efficient techniques. And at first, there was no interest. What are you talking about? Who cares? It's just buildings. We make buildings. We make buildings very well, thank you very much. We don't need to hear Americans tell us about our buildings. But then when I said, you know, you can save a lot of money. And they said, oh, that's interesting. Save money, okay, how much? A lot. You can save a lot of money. All of your government buildings, all of your schools, all of your hospitals, if they are energy efficient, you don't have to use as much energy. And energy is very expensive in North Korea. So suddenly, boom, there was interest. So you can present environmental questions in a way that the DPRK is very interested in. Climate change. North Korea is like, well, we don't have a very small carbon footprint, so who cares? We don't care about these climate change discussions. And then you say, actually, because you have a very small carbon footprint, you can qualify for carbon credits. And they say, well, what are carbon credits? He said, well, because you are not polluting, we will actually give you money. And if you reforest, we'll give you money for that too. And they're like, really? Really? We didn't know that. And then when you talk about tourism, and you talk about green tourism, like, well, of course we want to have more people come, and so we build a casino. We build a ski resort. And you say, well, you know, there are other people who would want to visit North Korea because of the natural beauty. They don't want to gamble. They want to see, you know, Kumgangsan. And you can get a whole new group of people that spend a lot of money for green tourism. And they say, oh, interesting. So there are ways of talking about environmental projects that the DPRK has already expressed interest in. You say that they have to rebuild their manufacturing capability, and you're absolutely right. North Korea is not going to be just a garden, you know? They're going to have factories. But what kind of factories? That's the question. And that's why I talk about leapfrog. If North and South Korea work together on energy efficient manufacturing, that's something entirely different from what North Korea had before. Maybe it's highly automated. Maybe it produces wind turbines and solar panels. So it's not only the type of product, but also how it is made, that I think are considerations that are very important. Someone said earlier about the danger of South Korean chaebols just going up north in a kind of colonial fashion. And that is a problem. I mean, the chaebols see North Korea as an opportunity. And it will be a terrible thing if the chaebols simply reproduce the same old style manufacturing or even current style manufacturing of South Korea in North Korea. Instead, the two should work together on next generation manufacturing. So those are different ways of presenting both the human rights issue and the environmental issue that I think North Korea is perfectly interested in. In other words, is not forcing North Korea to do something against its will. It's classic conflict resolution technique of finding what the common interest is. one last thing is, you said environmental movement here has not really engaged North Korea, and what can the government do on this issue, the South Korean government? Well, there has been some, of course, discussions, inter-Korean discussions on what could be considered environmental questions. So for instance, the question of fisheries, the question of transportation, the question of forestry. Ideally, the South Korean government creates a framework that allows South Korean NGOs to engage with their partners in North Korea on environmental issues. Obviously, there's an asymmetry here, because there are no NGOs in North Korea. So you have an asymmetry of South Korean NGOs working with the North Korean government, but still, that is, I think, a viable model. In other words, the South Korean government should not monopolize the environmental discussion. It should not be ministry to ministry. The South Korean government has to see itself as a facilitator that doesn't dominate the discussion.
좋은 말씀 들었습니다. 한국의 환경운동이 북한과 뭔가 협력하는 모델, 이런 거는 논의된다고 많지 않다고 저는 생각을 하기 때문에 오늘 좋은 그 관점을 볼 수 있지 않는가 그런 생각이 듭니다. 다음 분.
네, 감사합니다. 들으면서 저는 이제 경제학 쪽에 좀 관여를 하고 있는 사람의 한 사람으로서 매우 좀 흥미롭고 아주 신선한 말씀을 좀 들은 게 있는데, 이게 이제 아시아에서 통일과 통합이 반드시 친환경적이어야 된다라고 하는 이제 이슈. 이걸 관련해서 사실은 이제 북한 입장에서는 북한의 청정한 환경이 돈이 될 수 있는가, 이걸 북한이 어떻게 하면 알 수 있는가 문제가 또 있고, 사실은 이제 최근에 이제 북한과 미국의 협의 모두가 또 다른 차원의 경제적 이해관계가 있다. 즉 뭐냐면 미국은 핵 문제 해결한 다음에 그다음에 북한 내에 한 1조 원 정도 되는 이제 그 북한의 지하 자원들이 있습니다. 이걸 잠재된 자원의 욕심은 사실 내보이고 있어요. 이런 것은 또 환경하고 좀 다른 문제이죠. 그래서 지금 제안했던 그린 아시아를 그린 월드로 좀 격상시켜가지고, 그러니까 이후에 북한의 핵 문제가 끝난 다음에 북한의 문제는 다양한 이제 그린을 이슈로 한 스타트업 센터를 만들어서 벤처들을 많이 만들어서 어떤 것들에 집중을 좀 하고, 이를 위한 그 이코노믹 포럼 같은 뭐 이렇게 해서 민간 차원에서 그린 이코노믹 포럼을 만들어서 북한을 그린화시키고 청정 지역을 돈이 되게 하는 사업을 만들고 하는 것으로 하면 어떨까라는 생각이 좀 들고, 이를 위해서는 우선 지금 이제 미국의 소장님이시니까 미국 여론을 좀 환기시킬 필요가 있겠다. 그러니까 정치가 아닌 미국의 시민들을 좀 붕업을 시켜서 북한을 그렇게 접근하지 말자라고 하는 것들을 좀 이슈를 좀 만들어서 갔으면 좋겠다. 이렇게 생각이 좀 들고, 그리고 이제 이렇게 하기 위한 한반도를 이렇게 그린 월드로 또 이렇게 하기 위한 방법들, 그리고 세계적인 어떤 사람들이 붐업을 시킬 수 있고 한반도에 초점을 좀 가지고 한반도를 직시할 수 있는 방법들이 뭐가 있을까라고 하는 것을 좀 개인적으로 여쭤보고 싶습니다. 고맙습니다.
Again, those are very good questions. as you know, I'm sure, North Korea already has a very advanced and profitable IT sector. It has created software and hardware that is quite good. In fact, on animation, as you know, North Koreans have been participating in the creation of Hollywood films for decades. Well, not decades, but maybe 2 decades. So they are not just good, but they are at world standard. And that is a basically clean enterprise, basically. I mean, obviously there are some less clean than others in the IT sector, but North Korea has advantages of a very educated and skilled population. The disadvantage it has, unfortunately, is its size. It's only 25 million people. In other words, it's not like China. It's not going to attract the kind of investment that China attracted in the 1980s, 1990s, and afterwards. However, we have plenty of examples of countries that are relatively small that have found their comparative advantage. Hungary is only 10 million people. The Baltic states, Estonia, they're tiny countries, and yet they have found their comparative advantage and attracted a good deal of investment as well. So the challenge is twofold, actually, not just the population of North Korea, but what you pointed out, and that is what North Korea does have underneath its ground. In other words, it has lots of strategic minerals. And for the most part, the only country in the world that has figured that out is China. And China has already invested in considerable infrastructure inside North Korea so that it can extract those materials. China doesn't care, really, about developing North Korea, except to the extent that it helps China develop its own Northeast region. And here is where the sanctions become a problem. Because of the sanctions, we don't have a variety of different clean industries, clean entrepreneurs interested in coming to North Korea or being invited to North Korea. The sanctions are so counterproductive. I mean, it's actually ridiculous to think that the United States, which has promoted capitalism around the world for decades, has instituted sanctions that have prevented North Korea from effectively becoming a capitalist country. The North Korean government has absolutely no problems with capitalism as a system, as an ideology. All it cares about is the control of that particular system. It is perfectly happy bringing in multinational corporations as long as it can control those multinational corporations to a degree. So the sanctions, however, prevent that kind of economic activity. So unfortunately, until there is a sufficient lessening of sanctions that would allow, especially North and South Korea, to pursue joint economic programs, a green peninsula is frankly impossible, because there simply will not be any capital for it. And North Korea will continue to be isolated. So sanctions ultimately are the most important kind of factor here in reducing and ultimately eliminating those sanctions. And I agree with you that ultimately, you know, this is an international project. It's not just something for Koreans or for East Asians. But I do think that this region has a special role to play because of the concentration of economic power in this part of the world. How do you get people involved in this? How do you bring them into to this? Well, there's the positive and the negative. There's the incentive model and there's the threat model. I prefer the incentive model. People see that there are incentives to demand a green economy. They get jobs. They have cleaner neighborhoods. Their children, once they finish their education, will not be stuck in Hell Chosun. There'll be other jobs available for them. So that's the incentive side. But honestly, what's really going to bring people in is the other side, the threat side. It's the threat of climate change. It's, you have it here in Kamal as a result of monsoon weather, and you have rising sea levels that are already having effects in coastal cities like Busan. It will not only affect individuals, but it will affect farming. It has already affected farming, frankly. It will affect manufacturing. It will affect the livelihoods of people who are based around in coastal cities, and it will affect the fishery industry. So people will have to become involved because the threat is imminent. But between the two of those, the incentive and the threat, I think you can make this a very, very popular issue.
계속해서 좋은 그런 논의들이 생산되고 있는 것 같습니다. 지금 이야기들을 제 생각에는 조금 더 구체화시켜서 어떤 프로그램으로 좀 만드는 그런 논의를 하는 것도 필요할 것 같은 생각이 드는데 그런 것들은 좀 더 이런 제기된 이런 이슈들을 좀 다루는 그런 토론을 어떻게 좀 해갈 수 있을까 이런 생각을 그런 거를 어떻게 좀 프로그램으로 만들어 보는 방법이 없겠나 그런 생각을 해보게 됩니다. 아마 관심을 갖는 사람들이 생겨날 수 있지 않을까 그런 생각이 좀 들기도 합니다. 조금 더 질문하고 더 토론한 다음에 또 앞으로 어떻게 할 수 있는지 좀 얘기도 해보고 그랬으면 좋을 것 같습니다. 다음 제가 좀 관심을 가져서 좀 질문을 드리고 싶은 건데 아까 헬싱키 그룹에 대한 말씀을 하셨고 그 뒤에 프로그램 이슈들에 대해서 말씀을 하셨는데 저는 말하자면 인프라라고 할 수 있는 헬싱키 프로그램인가요? 회의인가요? 예. 그 회의의 그 아이디어를 동아시아에서 어떻게 좀 더 발전시켜 볼 수 있겠느냐 라고 하는 이것이 직접적으로 한반도 통합에 기여할 수도 있고 또 좀 간접적으로 기여할 수도 있지 않겠느냐 그런 생각이 듭니다. 그래서 그 부분에 대해서 조금 설명을 혹은 아이디어를 좀 더 말씀하실 수 있지 않을까. 동아시아에서의 헬싱키 프로세스를 좀더 헬싱키 무엇인가랄까. 네, 그렇습니다.
Yes, excellent question. So there was an attempt in the late 1990s and the 2000s to create a similar structure in Asia, not specifically Northeast Asia, but it was obviously there's the ASEAN process, and there was a group of civil society organizations that created into these intergovernmental discussions. It failed, and it failed because ultimately governments did not listen. It's, I guess, obvious in retrospect, but governments will only listen if they feel they have to listen. And First of all, they have to be democratic, or they won't listen at all. Second, the pressure has to come from people who have the possibility of voting them out of office. And if you have people from another country raising the issue, they'll say, who cares? They can't vote us out of office. We can say, yes, that's a very nice idea, but ultimately they're not going to listen or change their policy. So these are the challenges to such a structure. The other challenge is something I raised before, and that is there are serious disagreements, even between people here in Northeast Asia. Whether it's a history issue like the comfort women issue, or it's a territorial issue like Tokdo, or it's a textbook issue. There are fundamental issues that divide people in this region. And you know how difficult it is to, can you imagine creating an organization here in South Korea that promotes Korean-Japanese friendship at a popular level? Well, yes, there are exchanges of students, there are exchanges of teachers, but there is still a great deal of skepticism in South Korea about Japan as a country and even Japanese people and their intentions, as long as they keep voting for Shinzo Abe as their president, as their prime minister. And that's why I say environmental issue is a way around that. You say, just like you say with the human rights issue with North Korea, okay, we recognize there are human rights issues, but we're going to put them to one side, and we're going to focus on something else, like the DMZ. On the environmental issue, you can say, okay, we know that we disagree with each other on Tokdo, on comfort women. We don't insist that we come to some kind of consensus on these divisive issues. Let's just put them to one side and focus on what we can agree on. And we can agree that we are all affected by climate change issues. Ultimately, that means not only promoting dialogue between environmental organizations in the different countries, but it requires people who are not in environmental organizations to partner with environmental organizations. To say, I recognize that this threat, that this issue stands above even the issue that I am working on. And I will work with Green Korea. I will work with Green Japan. I will work with Green China on these issues. And so we set up popular organizations that have their counterparts in each of the countries, but more importantly are not just environmental activists. It includes people who see the importance of environmental issues and will partner with these organizations. I think that would be a difficult but important first step.
제가 조금 더 그 말씀 주제에 대해서 좀 말씀드리고 싶은 생각이 듭니다. 지금 백호 선생님 말씀은 서로 합의를 하는데 좀 어려움이 있을 거니까 조금 더 합의가 쉬운 이슈부터 좀 이야기하는 방법을 보자 하는 취지의 말씀으로 이해가 되는데 당연히 그것은 옳은 말씀입니다. 그런데 제가 좀 하나 소개를 하고 싶은 거는 한중일 평화 포럼이라는 그 상중일 3국 간의 평화를 다루는 미팅이 있습니다. 그런데 작년에 미팅에서는 광주에서 모였는데 이것은 일본이나 중국의 참가자들한테는 좀 부담스러운 이슈입니다. 왜냐하면 시민사회와 정부의 갈등이 있어가지고 그거를 더 시민사회의 역할을 더 강조하는 지금 이슈입니다. 그리고 또 그 다음에는 그 전에는 남경 학살에 대한 주제를 다뤘는데 남경 학살에 대한 주제는 일본 참가자들로서는 굉장히 부담스러운 이슈입니다. 그런데 이런 이슈들에 대해서 함께 입장을 같이 해왔습니다. 저는 그게 어려운 이슈를 같이 움직여온 사례라고 생각이 듭니다. 그래서 제 생각에는 그런 이슈를 다루는 방법도 하나 있고, 또 하나는 각 국가 안에서 시민사회를 강화하는 이슈 자체가 각 여러 NGO, 여러 시빌 소사이티 조직들이 공통으로 가지고 있는 동질한 관심사가 있습니다. 동아시아에서 시민사회 자체를 각 국가 안에서 개발하는 문제에 관해서 서로 뜻을 함께하고 협력한다. 이런 일들을 이야기하는 것도 하나의 공통의 주제가 될 수가 있지 않겠느냐. 이것은 당장의 이슈들을, 현안 이슈들을 다루지는 못하겠지만은 시민사회를 발전시키는 이 인프라를 어떻게 더 발전시켜 나가느냐. 이것은 중국도 필요로 하고 한국도 필요로 하고 일본도 필요로 하는 것이고, 여기에 서로 기본적으로 공감하는 그런 토대가 어느 정도 있다고 생각합니다. 저는 그래서 그런 그 사례들을 기초로 해서 조금 이 어려운 합의 과정을 필요로 하겠지만은, 그러나 기본적인 가치가 민주주의, 시민사회, 자유, 평화, 통일 이런 주제들에 대해서 더 가치관을 강화하면 하는 그런 노력을 통해서 이렇게 아시아, 동아시아 지역에서의 시빌 소사이티의 발전 이런 것들을 좀 추진하는 방향으로 그렇게 좀 노력을 해볼 여지가 있지 않을까. 지금 말씀하신 그런 이슈들을 다루는 것과 마찬가지 그걸 포함해서 그래서 좀 양면적인 방향으로 노력을 해볼 수도 있지 않겠느냐, 이런 지금 생각을 좀 해보게 됩니다. 저희 광주에서 모였을 때는 광주 학살의 그 희생자들이 모인 묘역에 다 같이 갔습니다. 그 수천 명의 그런 피학살자들이 묻혀 있는, 수천 명이 아니고 수십 명, 수백 명 되겠지만 그런 장소에 중국 사람들과 일본 사람들이 같이 간 것은 상당히 좀 쉽지 않은 경험이었을 거라고 생각이 듭니다. 그런데 이분들이 모두 다 그 프로그램을 같이 갔고, 서강선 박사님이 자기 생을 통한 일본에서 겪은 피해를 말씀을 하셨는데 그런 걸 다 같이 공감을 하고 들었습니다. 그래서 이런 것들을 잘 좀 살려보는 그런 방법으로 한번 해볼 수 있는 그런 가능성이 있지 않을까, 이런 기대를 좀 해볼 말씀을 좀 드리고 싶습니다.
I think that's a very powerful example, and I don't want to underestimate, or I don't want you to underestimate the power of a common threat. France and Germany had hundreds of years of conflict. After World War II, they came together in part because of the experience of the war and its devastation, but also because of a perception of a common threat. The effort, for instance, by French and German historians to come up with a common understanding of history and textbooks was part of this process. And the common threat at the time, of course, was the Soviet Union. The European Union and the efforts to build coal and steel agreement, and then ultimately the European community, it took place within a Cold War environment in which the Soviet Union was the glue that brought together these countries. Well, I don't think that there should be a country that should be the common threat today. You know, I'm not saying we should say Russia and Vladimir Putin is now the common threat. No, we have to find a different kind of common threat, and that, for me, is climate change. That is the threat that brings countries together in a way that all the other discussions based on goodwill and good thinking won't achieve. Because ultimately, we are weak people. And as weak people, we respond to threat. But I'd like it to be a threat like climate change, not a national threat like the Soviet Union or its successor state, Russia. So, perhaps we can end there unless there's an urgent question.
예, 그 질문이 있으시면은 이 모임 이걸로 마치도록 하겠습니다.
시간이 남았나요?
시간이 지금 그러면
다 됐나요?
예, 참사 그러면
나오셨다고 남았다고.
네, 그러면은 간단하게
아, 다른 분들이 질문이 없으니까 제가 좀 불편한 진실에 대해서 좀 얘기를 저희가 그러니까 한국에 사는 저희가 지금 올해 많은 긍정적인 것들을 겪고 있지만 특히 진보 쪽에 있는 사람들 굉장히 불편한 거는 우리의 파트너가 트럼프라는 겁니다. 굉장히 폭력적이고 공격적이고 그다음에 세계 질서를 깨뜨리고 다니는 사람과 우리가 뭔가를 해야 된다는 거 굉장히 불편한 지점이고 또 하나는 트럼프가 그 일을 하기 때문에 정치권 내에서 민주당 쪽에서 굉장히 또 불편함을 가지고 있다는 거. 그래서 우리가 염려하는 거는 트럼프가 재임을 하기를 바라지 않지만 하여튼 어찌됐든 트럼프가 가고 나고 민주당이 정권을 잡았을 때 우리가 이 페이스를 민주당 정권하고 계속 가지고 갈 수 있을 것인가 하는 거. 그래서 그 미국 내의 그 한반도 그 지금 진전 상황을 트럼프가 하고 있는 진전 상황을 바라보는 지점에서 정치적인 그 맥락들 좀 우리가 좀 이해할 수 있는 도움이 되는 그런 걸 좀 얘기해 주시면 좋을 것 같아요.
So whenever I'm talking about Trump here in Korea, I say, I hate everything Trump does. 한반도 문제 제외하고, except for the Korean Peninsula issue. And it's true that the Democrats have generally taken a pretty stupid position. And they've taken a stupid position because it was the consensus position in American foreign policy, that only maximum pressure will get North Korea to the negotiating table. So, but two things I would say. One, Donald Trump will not win the election in 2020 because of Korea. If he wins, it will have nothing to do with Korea. It doesn't matter if he gets a Nobel Prize, if peace breaks out. Americans could care less about foreign policy in general, unless it's a war. And they're going to be voting for entirely different reasons. So don't worry. Go ahead and reunify, and don't worry about its effect on the 2020 election. That's number one. Number two, the Democrats could reverse whatever small amount of US-North Korean rapprochement has occurred. However, the most important thing for the next 2 years is to push as far as you can in changing the facts on the ground between the two Koreas. I'm not talking about declarations, I'm talking about actually changing things. So this last agreement from the third Inter-Korean Summit is absolutely critical. You dismantle guard posts, you demine the DMZ, you establish a no-fly zone, you reconnect the railroad, you do everything you possibly can within the constraints established by the sanctions regime and all other obstacles, and you change it so that it doesn't matter who gets elected in the United States, because they will have to acknowledge the facts on the ground. So I'll give you an example. Trump has reversed Cuba policy that Obama established. But has that completely transformed US-Cuba relations? No, not completely. There's still people traveling to Cuba. There's still economic trade between specific states and Cuba. It's just the federal government doesn't have as much of a relationship. And we haven't, completely severed diplomatic relations. So the Obama administration changed facts on the ground so that it limited Trump's ability. Second example, the Iran agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Okay, Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, from the nuclear deal, but Europe is still involved. And in fact, Europe is saying, look, even if you are threatening us with secondary sanctions, we are going to continue to have a relationship with Iran. In other words, it changes the facts on the ground. It limits what an American president can do. So that's what you have to do. You have to change as many facts on the ground as possible. So instead of the United States limiting your possibilities, you limit the US possibilities. Ultimately, that's your challenge.
저는 이 세션의 주제가 굉장히 흥미로운 주제라고 생각을 했는데 오늘 지금 우리 강사님 통해서 좋은 시각도 좀 다시 얻게 되고 또 현실적인 접근하는 방법에 대한 아이디어 또 굉장히 풍부한 그 여러 가지 아이디어에 대해서 오늘 아주 유익한 시간이었던 것 같습니다. 다시 한번 박수. 그러면은 좋은 발표를 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.